Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. I'm going to continue reading Charlie and the Chocolate Factory today. As you remember last time, another one of the girls disappeared. Her name was Violet, and she ate this piece of gum that was flavored like a blueberry pie, and she turned into a blueberry. So the Oompa Loompas took her away to get her back to normal, and here Charlie is continuing his journey through the factory. Chapter 23. Square Candies That Look Round. Everybody stopped and crowded to the door. The top half of the door was made of glass. Grandpa Joe lifted Charlie up so that he could get a better view, and looking in, Charlie saw a long table, and on the table there were rows and rows of small, white, square-shaped candies. The candies looked very much like square sugar lumps, except that each of them had a funny little pink face painted on one side. At the end of the table, a number of Oompa Loompas were busily painting more faces on more candies. "There you are," cried Mr. Wonka. "Square candies that look round." "They don't look round to me," said Mike TV. "They look square," said Veruca Salt. "They look completely square." "But they are square," said Mr. Wonka. "I never said they weren't. You said they were round." "I never said anything of the sort," said Mr. Wonka. "I said they looked round." "But they don't look round. They look square." "They look round," insisted Mr. Wonka. "They most certainly do not look round," cried Veruca Salt. "Veruca, darling," said Mrs. Salt, "pay no attention to Mr. Wonka. He's lying to you." "My dear old fish," said Mr. Wonka, "go and boil your head." "How dare you speak to me like that?" shouted Mrs. Salt. "Oh, do shut up," said Mr. Wonka. "Now watch this." He took a key from his pocket and unlocked the door and flung it open. And suddenly, at the sound of the door opening, all the rows and rows of little square candies looked quickly round to see who was coming in. The tiny faces actually turned toward the door and stared at Mr. Wonka. "There you are," he cried triumphantly. "They're looking round. There's no argument about it. They are square candies that look round." "By golly, he's right," said Grandpa Joe. "Come on," said Mr. Wonka, starting off down the corridor again. "On we go. We mustn't dawdle." "Butterscotch and butter gin," it said on the next door they passed. "Now that sounds a bit more interesting," said Mr. Salt, Veruca's father. "Glorious stuff," said Mr. Wonka. "The Oompa Loompas all adore it. It makes them tiddly. Listen, you can hear them now and there, now, whooping it up." Shrieks of laughter and snatches of singing could be heard coming through the closed door. "They're drunk as lords," said Mr. Wonka. "They're drinking butterscotch and soda. They like that the best of all. Butter gin and tonic is also very popular. Follow me, please. We really mustn't keep stopping like this." He turned left, he turned right. They came to a long flight of stairs. Mr. Wonka slid down the banisters. The three children did the same. Mrs. Salt and Mrs. TV, the only woman now left in the party, were getting very out of breath. Mrs. Salt was a great fat creature with short legs. She was blowing like a rhinoceros. "This way," cried Mr. Wonka, turning left at the bottom of the stairs. "Go slower," panted Mrs. Salt. "Impossible," said Mr. Wonka. "We should never get there in time if I did." "Get where?" asked Veruca Salt. "Never you mind," said Mr. Wonka. "You just wait and see." Chapter 24. Veruca in the Nut Room. Mr. Wonka rushed on down the corridor. "The Nut Room," it said on the next door they came to. "All right," said Mr. Wonka. "Stop here for a moment and catch your breath and take a peek through the glass panel of this room. But don't go in. Whatever you do, don't go into the Nut Room. If you do go in, You'll disturb the squirrels." Everyone crowded around the door. "Oh, look, Grandpa, look!" cried Charlie. "Squirrels!" shouted Veruca Salt. "Jeepers!" said Mike TV. It was an amazing sight. 100 squirrels were seated upon high stools around a large table. On the table there were mounds and mounds of walnuts, and the squirrels were all working away like mad, shelling the walnuts at a tremendous speed. "These squirrels are specially trained for getting the nuts out of walnuts," Mr. Wonka explained. "Why use squirrels?" Mike Tibby asked. "Why not use Oompa Loompas?" "Because," said Mr. Wonka, "Oompa Loompas can't get walnuts out of walnut shells in one piece. They always break them in two. Nobody except squirrels can get walnuts whole out of walnut shells every time. It is extremely difficult, but in my factory I insist upon using only whole walnuts. Therefore, I have to have squirrels to do the job. Aren't they wonderful? The way they get those nuts out. And see how they first tap each walnut with their knuckles to make sure it's not a bad one. If it's bad, it makes a hollow sound and they don't bother to open it. They just throw it down the garbage chute. There, look! Watch that squirrel nearest to us. I think he's got a bad one now." They watched the little squirrel as he tapped the walnut shell with his knuckles. He cocked his head to one side, listening intently. Then suddenly he threw the nut over his shoulder and into a large hole in the floor. "Hey, Mummy," shouted Veruca Salt suddenly. "I've decided I want a squirrel. Get me one of those squirrels." "Don't be silly, sweetheart," said Mrs. Salt. "These all belong to Mr. Wonka." "I don't care about that," shouted Veruca. "I want one. All I've got at home is 2 dogs, and 4 cats, and 6 bunny rabbits, and 2 parakeets, and 3 canaries, and a green parrot, and a turtle, and a bowl of goldfish, and a cage of white mice, and a silly old hamster. I want a squirrel." "All right, my pet," Mrs. Salt said soothingly. "Mommy'll get you a squirrel just as soon as she possibly can." "But I don't want any old squirrel," Veruca shouted. "I want a trained squirrel, like this one." At this point, Mr. Salt, Veruca's father, stepped forward. "Very well, Wonka," he said importantly, taking out a wallet full of money. "How much do you want for one of those squirrels? Name your price." "They're not for sale," Mr. Wonka answered. "She can't have one." "Who says I can't?" shouted Veruca. "I'm going in to grab me a squirrel this very minute." "Don't!" said Mr. Wonka quickly, but he was too late. The girl had already thrown open the door and rushed in. The moment she entered the door, 100 squirrels stopped what they were doing and turned their heads and stared at her with small black beady eyes. Veruca Salt stopped also and stared back at them. Then her gaze fell upon a pretty little squirrel sitting nearest to her at the end of the table. The squirrel was holding a walnut in its paws. "All right," Veruca said, "I'll have you." She reached out her hands to grab the squirrel, but as she did so, in that first split second when her hands started to go forward, there was a sudden flash of movement in the room, like a flash of brown lightning, and every squirrel around the table took a flying leap towards her and landed on her body. 25 of them caught hold of her right arm and pinned it down. 25 more caught hold of her left arm and pinned that down. 25 caught hold of her right leg and anchored it to the ground. 24 caught hold of her left leg. And the one squirrel remaining, obviously the leader of them all, climbed up onto her shoulders and started tapping the wretched girl's head with its knuckles. "Save her!" screamed Mrs. Salt. "Veruca, come back! What are they doing to her?" "They're testing her to see if she's a bad nut," said Mr. Wonka. "You watch." Veruca struggled furiously, but the squirrels held her tight, and she could not move. The squirrel on her shoulder kept tapping the side of her head with its knuckles. And all at once, the squirrels pulled Veruca to the ground and started carrying her across the floor. "My goodness, she is a bad nut after all," said Mr. Wonka. "Her head must have sounded quite hollow." Veruca kicked and screamed, but it was no use. The tiny, strong paws held her tightly, and she could not escape. "Where are they taking her?" shrieked Mrs. Salt. "She's going where all the other bad nuts go," said Mr. Wonka. "Down the garbage chute." "By golly, she is going down the chute," said Mr. Salt, staring through the glass door at his daughter. "Then save her," cried Mrs. Salt. "Too late," said Mr. Wonka. "She's gone." And indeed she was. "But where?" shrieked Mrs. Salt, flapping her arms. "What happens to the bad nuts? Where does the chute go to?" "That particular chute," Mr. Wonka told her, "runs directly into the great big main garbage pipe that carries away all the rubbish from every part of the factory. All the floor sweepings and potato peelings and rotten cabbages and fish heads and stuff like that." "Who eats fish and cabbage and potatoes in this factory, I'd like to know," said Mike Teavee. "I do, of course," answered Mr. Wonka. "You don't think I live on cacao beans, do you?" But, shrieked Mrs. Salt, "where does the great big pipe go to in the end?" "Why, to the furnace, of course. To the incinerator." Mrs. Salt opened her huge red mouth and started to scream. "Don't worry," said Mr. Wonka. "There's always a chance that they've decided not to light it today." "A chance?" yelled Mrs. Salt. "My darling Veruca, she'll be sizzled like a sausage." "Quite right, my dear," said Mr. Salt. "Now see here, Wonka," he added. "I think you've got just a shade too far this time. I do indeed. My daughter may be a bit of a frump. I don't mind admitting it. But that doesn't mean you can roast her to a crisp. I'll have you know I'm extremely cross about this. I really am." "Oh, don't be cross, my dear sir," said Mr. Wonka. "I expect she'll turn up again sooner or later. She may not even have gone down at all. She may be stuck in the chute just below the entrance hole. And if that's the case, all you'll have to do is go in and pull her up again." Hearing this, both Mr. and Mrs. Salt dashed into the nut room and ran over to the hole in the floor and peered in. "Veruca," shouted Mrs. Salt, "are you down there?" There was no answer. Mrs. Salt bent further forward to get a closer look. She was now kneeling right on the edge of the hole with her head down and her enormous behind sticking up in the air like a giant mushroom. It was a dangerous position to be in. She needed only one tiny little push, one gentle nudge in the right place, and that is exactly what the squirrels gave her. Over she toppled into the hole head first, screeching like a parrot. "Good gracious me," said Mr. Salt, as he watched his fat wife go tumbling down the hole. "What a lot of garbage there's going to be today." He saw her disappearing into the darkness. "What's it like down there, Angina?" he called out. He leaned further forward. The squirrels rushed up behind him. "Help!" he shouted. But he was already toppling forward, and down the chute he went, just as his wife had done before him, and his daughter. "Oh dear," cried Charlie, who was watching with the others through the door. "What on earth's going to happen to them now?" "I expect someone will catch them at the bottom of the chute," said Mr. Wonka. "But what about the great fiery incinerator?" asked Charlie. "They only light it every other day," said Mr. Wonka. "Perhaps this is one of the days when they let it go out. You never know, they might be lucky." "Shh," said Grandpa Joe. "Listen, here comes another song." From far away down the corridor came the beating of drums. Then the singing began. "Veruca Salt," sang the Oompa Loompas. "Veruca Salt, the little brute, has just gone down the garbage chute. And as we very rightly thought, that in a case like this we ought to see the thing completely through. We've polished off her parents, too. Down goes Veruca down the drain, and here, perhaps, we should explain that she will meet, as she descends, a rather different set of friends to those that she has left behind. These won't be nearly so refined. A fish head, for example, caught this morning from a halibut. Hello, good morning, how do you do? Nice to meet you, how are you? And then a little further down, a mass of others gather round. A bacon rind, or some rancid lard, a loaf of bread gone stale and hard, a steak that nobody could chew, an oyster from an oyster stew, some liverwurst so old and gray, one smelled it from a mile away, a rotten nut, a reeky pear, a thing the cat left on the stair, and lots of other things as well, each with a rather horrid smell. These are Veruca's new-found friends that she will meet as she descends, and this is the price she has to pay for going so very far astray. But now, my dears, we think you might be wondering, is it really right that every single bit of blame and all the scolding and the shame should fall upon Veruca Salt? Is she the only one at fault? For though she's spoiled, and dreadfully so, a girl can't spoil herself, you know. Who spoiled her then? Ah, who indeed? Who pandered to her every need? Who turned her into such a brat? Who are the culprits? Who did that? Alas, you needn't look so far to find out who these sinners are. They are, and this is very sad, her loving parents, Mum and Dad. And that is why we're glad they fell into the garbage chute as well. Chapter 25. The Great Glass Elevator. I've never seen anything like it, cried Mr. Wonka. The children are disappearing like rabbits, but you mustn't worry about it. They'll all come out in the wash. Mr. Wonka looked at the little group that stood beside him in the corridor. There were only 2 children left now, Mike TV and Charlie Bucket, and there were 3 grown-ups, Mr. and Mrs. TV and Grandpa Joe. Shall we move on? Mr. Wonka asked. Oh yes, cried Charlie and Grandpa Joe both together. My feet are getting tired, said Mike TV. I want to watch television. If you're tired, then we'd better take the elevator, said Mr. Wonka. It's over here. Come on, in we go. He skipped across the passage to a pair of double doors. The doors slid open. The 2 children and the grown-ups went in. Now then, cried Mr. Wonka, which button shall we press first? Take your pick. Charlie Bucket stared around him in astonishment. This was the craziest elevator he had ever seen. There were buttons everywhere. The walls and even the ceiling were covered, all with rows and rows and rows of small, black push-buttons. There must have been 1,000 of them on each wall, and another 1,000 on the ceiling. And now Charlie noticed that every single button had a tiny printed label beside it, telling you which room you would be taken to if you pressed it. This isn't just an ordinary up-and-down elevator, announced Mr. Wonka proudly. This elevator can go sideways and long ways and slant ways and any other way you can think of. It can visit any single room in the whole factory, no matter where it is. You simply press the button and zing, you're off. Fantastic, murmured Grandpa Joe. His eyes were shining with excitement as he stared at the rows and rows of buttons. The whole elevator is made of thick, clear glass, Mr. Wonka declared. Walls, doors, ceiling, floor, everything is made of glass so that you can see out. But there's nothing to see, said Mike TV. Choose a button, said Mr. Wonka. The 2 children may press 1 button each, so take your pick. Hurry up. In every room, something delicious and wonderful is being made. Quickly, Charlie started reading some of the labels alongside the buttons. The rock candy mine, 10,000 feet deep, it said on one. Coconut ice skating rinks, it said on another. Then, strawberry juice water pistols, toffee apple trees for planting out in your garden, all sizes, exploding candy for your enemies, luminous lollies for eating in bed at night, mint jujubes for the boy next door. They'll give him green tooth for a month. Cavity-filling caramels. No more dentists. Stick jaw for talkative parents. Wriggle sweets that wriggle delightfully in your tummy after swallowing. Invisible chocolate bars for eating in class. Candy-coated pencils for sucking. Fizzy lemonade swimming pools. Magic hand fudge. When you hold it in your hand, you taste it in your mouth. Rainbow drops. Suck them and you can spit in 6 different colors. Come on, cried Mr. Wonka. We can't wait all day. Isn't there a television room in all of this lot? Asked Mike TV. Certainly there's a television room, Mr. Wonka said. That button over there. He pointed with his finger. Everybody looked. Television chocolate, it said on the tiny label besides the button. Whoopee! Shouted Mike TV. That's for me. He stuck out his thumb and pressed the button. Instantly there was a tremendous whizzing noise. The doors clanged shut, and the elevator leaped away as though it had been stung by a wasp, but it leapt sideways. And all the passengers, except Mr. Wonka, who was holding on to a strap from the ceiling, were flung off their feet onto the floor. Get up, cried Mr. Wonka, roaring with laughter. But just as they were staggering to their feet, the elevator changed direction and swerved violently around the corner. And over they went once again. Help, shouted Mrs. TV. Take my hand, madam, said Mr. Wonka gallantly. There you are. Now on to the strap. Everybody grab a strap. The journey's not over yet. Old Grandpa Joe staggered to his feet and caught hold of a strap. Little Charlie, who couldn't possibly reach as high as that, put his arms around Grandpa Joe's legs and hung on tight. The elevator rushed on at the speed of a rocket. Now it was beginning to climb. It was shooting up and up and up on a steep, slanty course as if it were climbing a very steep hill. Then suddenly, as though it had come to the top of a hill and gone over a precipice, it dropped like a stone, and Charlie felt his tummy coming right up into his throat, and Grandpa Joe shouted, Yippee, here we go! And Mrs. TV cried out, The rope has broken, we're going to crash. And Mr. Wonka said, Calm yourself, my dear lady, and patted her confrontingly on the arm. And then Grandpa Joe looked down at Charlie, who was clinging to his legs, and he said, Are you all right, Charlie? Charlie shouted, I love it. It's like being on a roller coaster. And through the glass walls of the elevator, as it rushed along, they caught sudden glimpses of strange and wonderful things going on in other rooms. An enormous spout of brown sticky stuff oozing out of it onto the floor. A great craggy mountain made entirely of fudge, with Oompa Loompas all roped together for safety, hacking huge hunks of fudge out of its sides. A machine with white powder spraying out of it like a snowstorm. A lake of hot caramel with steam coming off it. A village of Oompa Loompas with tiny houses and streets and hundreds of Oompa Loompa children, no more than 4 inches high, playing in the streets. And now the elevator began flattening out again. But it seemed to be going faster than ever, and Charlie could hear the scream of the wind outside as it hurtled forward. And it twisted, and it turned, and it went up, and it went down, and, oh, I'm gonna be sick, yelled Mrs. TV, turning green in the face. Please don't be sick, said Mr. Wonka. Try and stop me, said Mrs. TV. Then you'd better take this, said Mr. Wonka, and he swept his magnificent black top hat off his head, held it out upside down in front of Miss TV's mouth. "Make this awful thing stop," ordered Mr. TV. "Can't do that," said Mr. Wonka. "It won't stop till we get there. I only hope no one's using the other elevator at this moment." "What other elevator?" screamed Mrs. TV. "The one that goes the opposite way on the same track as this one," said Mr. Wonka. "Holy mackerel," cried Mr. TV. "You mean we might have a collision?" "I've always been lucky so far," said Mr. Wonka. "Now I am going to be sick," yelled Mrs. TV. "No, no," said Mr. Wonka. "Not now. We're nearly there. Don't spoil my hat." The next moment there was a screaming of brakes, and the elevator began to slow down. Then it stopped altogether. "Some ride," said Mr. TV, wiping his great sweaty face with a handkerchief. "Never again," gasped Mrs. TV. And then the doors of the elevator slid open, and Mr. Wonka said, "Just a minute now. Listen to me. I want everybody to be very careful in this room. There is dangerous stuff around in here, and you must not tamper with it." But what happens next time, you will find out tomorrow. So, I hope you enjoyed today's reading. Please join me tomorrow at 4 to see what happens in the television chocolate room. And next time we're going to actually finish the book because it's almost over. So thanks a lot for joining me, and have a wonderful day, and I'll see you tomorrow.